The first speaker is Professor Raimond Gaita. He is a professional fellow in the Melbourne Law School and the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne in Australia. He is also Emeritus Professor of Moral Philosophy at King's College in London. He is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities. I'll just mention this one important award. In 2009, the University of Antwerp awarded Gaita the degree of Doctor Honoris Causa for his exceptional contribution to contemporary moral philosophy and for his singular contribution to the role of the intellectual in today's academic world. And his work really reflects that. He has written dozens of articles and papers and important work about good and evil and other aspects of human rights. So I would like to welcome him enormously for making this long trip. And the topic of his lecture today is human rights and the frail idea of a common humanity. Please welcome Professor Gaita.
Well, thank you. I'm very honored to be here. My lecture is slightly different to the one that's advertised, for which you can blame Hodder, and for its length you can blame jet lag. The story is this, that when I had accepted the invitation to come here, not long after I'd also accepted the invitation to speak to an international postgraduate conference in St Andrews in Scotland. And I had told the organisers of that conference that I would be giving the same talk there as I gave here. However, I decided to write a different talk for them. And when I discussed this with yesterday in the hotel with Hodder, she thought the one I wrote for them might be better. The trouble is, I finished that only a few days before, and I thought I had it till April the 6th to cut it, and I don't. I thought I might do it last night, but I'm afraid that me and my brain are not in the same place. My brain is somewhere between here and Australia. I'm afraid this will take the full hour. In what follows, I'll use some Australian examples that have general significance. And much of what I say about the Indigenous peoples of Australia applies to Indigenous peoples of the US and to a lesser extent Canada, for example. It's striking how often we speak of in ethically inflected registers or ethically resonant tones about the idea of humanity, as when, for example, we speak of seeing or failing to see the full humanity of people or peoples, of dehumanization, of the common humanity of all the peoples of the earth, or that some ways of being and living are not worthy of our humanity. And we do so more, I think, now than even 10 years ago. It's also striking how often we speak of our humanity as something that's not given to us once and for all, as species membership is, but something to which we're called upon to rise, not until such time as we achieve it, which could be different from one person to another, but unendingly for all of us until we die. Some people think of it as a gift we betray if we don't try to be lucid about things that matter most to us, or about what should matter most to us. How terrible they think it would be to go to one's grave in a cloud cuckoo land. Socrates meant that, I think, when to explain why he couldn't stop philosophizing even under the threat of death, he said that an unexamined life is not worthy of a human being. The two seem interdependent. To recognize the humanity of others, we must rise to the humanity in ourselves. But to do that, we must at least be open to seeing fully the humanity of all people and peoples, and to the different forms that can take ethically. In a similar way, the acknowledgement of human rights, rights that all human beings are said to possess merely by virtue of being human, appears to be interdependent with the acknowledgement of a common humanity with them. The same is true for the recognition of the dignity of humanity, with a big D, to which an unconditional respect is owed as it exists inalienably in every human being, an affirmation that's found in preambles to important instruments of international law. I've repeatedly said it seems to, or it appears to, because obviously things are not always as they appear. And in this connection, it's important to remember how varied the ethical inflections of the way we speak of humanity are when we don't mean to speak directly of the species, Homo sapiens. The ethical inflections are diverse for two reasons. Firstly, there are many forms of the ethical. There's morality, politics, law, love, for example. Secondly, about all these forms, there are disagreements about what they truly are. Disagreements not only about what to do, morally or legally, for example, but also about what morality and law are. Thus, to take an example important to my later discussion, preambles to some important instruments of international law speak of the inherent dignity of humanity, or the dignity of the person, or of inalienable dignity. The world looks very different to people who believe that every human being possesses an inalienable dignity to which unconditional respect is owed than it does to those who do not believe this. They'll understand differently what it means to wrong somebody, what it means for the person to be fully aware of that wrong, because it will give a distinctive content to the idea of a violation. And that will affect their understanding of what it is to see or to fail to see someone as fully human, and therefore what talk of a common humanity might come to. They'll understand differently most of the virtues and the vices, and what compassion and love most truly are. The golden rule that one should always treat others as one would wish to be treated, which many people take to be the basic precept of morality, and to capture the essence of the biblical command to love one's neighbour, that too will be understood differently by those who believe that human beings possess inalienable dignity than by those who do not. But there are people and peoples who do not share this idea, who have never heard of it, or if they have, scorn it. More often than not, when we refer to the idea of a common humanity, it's to lament the failure of its acknowledgement. The forms of that failure are depressingly many: racism, sexism, the dehumanization of our enemies, or of unrepentant criminals, and also of those who suffer severe and degrading affliction. As often as someone reminds us that we're all human beings, someone will reply that to be treated like a human being, you must first behave like one. And there are two explanations for this. Each has its place. One assumes that we retain a firm hold on the idea that all the peoples of the earth share a common humanity, but for various psychological, social, political, and moral reasons, we fail to live up to it. The other suggests that the ethical significance of the very idea of a common humanity waxes and wanes with us, and at times, when we dehumanize our enemies or are vulnerable to racism and aggressive forms of nationalism, for example, become literally unintelligible to us. And before I develop these thoughts, I must clear some conceptual ground in case we trip over obstacles to understanding what I'm trying to say. You may already have noticed that I don't equate ethics with morality. Though the distinction between morality and ethics is an old one, there's no agreement about how to draw it. I think of the ethical as a realm in which we speak about how to live, about the meanings of things in our lives. We think about morality, of course, but also about law, politics, and other matters, about the demands intrinsic to the various forms of love and how to rise to them, for example. I think of these, as I shall later try to explain, as distinctive realms of value, sui generis, in complex ways interconnected, and sometimes in conflict. Love in all its forms has ethical standards intrinsic to it, standards that distinguish love from its many counterfeits. Love of one's friends may conflict with love of country, both with morality, morality with politics, and both with law. So though I speak in the singular of the ethical, I wouldn't do so of the values in its domain. There are, as I said a moment ago, many conceptions of morality, not only of what to do, but also of what it is, what kind of place it can or should have in our lives. And the same is true of the other forms of the ethical, of what it is to love truly, or of the distinctive responsibilities of a political vocation. I've already said that the ethical inflections of the ways we speak about humanity are varied and depend on the ethical conceptions that inform those inflections. To say that a shamelessly unrepentant wrongdoer should be accorded justice, though his crimes are horrific because he's a human being, is not to offer an explanation for why he's owed justice in the way it would be if we were to say that though he's undeserving of it, we should observe the procedures of justice because we may otherwise find ourselves on a slippery slope, corrupting our judicial institutions and our culture more generally. Rather, it's more like saying, as the philosopher Cora Diamond alerted us in a fine paper some years ago, that in such circumstances, to say that he should be treated justly is intrinsic to our understanding of what it is to be a human being, essential to our very conception of it. So it functions as a reminder rather than an explanation or perhaps in the case of this example of an unrepentant wrongdoer, an invitation to think of humanity in this way, an invitation that might, of course, be declined, sometimes rebuffed, sometimes with contempt. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, states in its preambles that, quote, "The recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." Many other preambles to important instruments of international law speak the same language. The Convention Against Torture, for example, speaks of the inalienable rights that derive from the, quote, "inherent dignity of the person." And these preambles suggest that the idea of the dignity of humanity, of a dignity that one possesses simply by virtue of being human, underpins the concept of an inalienable right and is fundamental to an elaboration of what it means ethically to violate such a right. The moral character of crimes against humanity is often rendered as an offence against human dignity of those who suffer them, and it's now almost second nature to us to speak of human rights and the dignity that's been offended when a person's human rights are violated. The concepts of inalienable dignity and inalienable human rights as we use them are clearly of European origin. Indeed, the resonances they now carry for us are almost always the heroic resonances of Kant's moral and political philosophies. That's not of itself a bad thing. As I've already remarked, cultures have existed in which there was not even a hint of those ethical concepts, and cultures now exist which regard them as absurd. Absurd to think that Saddam Hussein, for example, was owed a fair trial for his sake, rather than because it might place the integrity of the legal system on a slippery slope. That an imperative so sublime as the one that requires us to respect the humanity of even those guilty of the foulest crimes should show itself in ways as prosaic as observing judicial procedures might seem paradoxical. It might make us complacent, forgetful of how wondrous it is that humanity should ever have come to such an affirmation. In much of my work, I've tried to reclaim a sense of such wondrousness, to create the right conceptual space in which it can find an authentic and compelling voice that could answer someone who says, if you want to be treated like a human being, you should first behave like one. That people like Saddam and many of the fighters for ISIS are vermin. I must add, though, that I wouldn't trust anybody who affirmed that even such people possess inalienable dignity to which we owe unconditional respect, unless they were tempted to believe, as many people do, as Churchill did indeed of Nazis' charge at Nuremberg, that they should have been shot in the street like rabid dogs. The ethical inflections of the way we speak about humanity play their distinctive roles, I think, when we reflect about the human condition rather than on human nature or on the biological characteristics of Homo sapiens. Be a human being for once in your life is evidently not an injunction to be more fully a member of the species, Homo sapiens. Socrates did not mean that an unexamined life is not worthy of the species, Homo sapiens. And he's not a monster, he's a human being. He's not a reminder that a terrible wrongdoer has not thereby forfeited his species membership. Nor, for that matter, is the rejoinder. If you want to be treated like a human being, then first behave like one. That's not an assertion that, after all, he has. I'll try to explain why I distinguish reflection on human nature from reflection on the human condition, though the distinction is not a sharp one, and there is plenty of back and forth between them. I think of human nature as revealed to us in experience of a kind that is corrected and deepened by the sciences. Claims about it are characteristically empirical claims, and when there's non-collusive agreement about them, certified by a community of relevant scholars, usually scientists of one kind or another, they find their way into textbooks and encyclopedias and sometimes even earn Nobel Prizes. Reflection on the human condition, by contrast, is on the meaning human beings have made of the big facts of life: birth, death, sexuality, our vulnerability to misfortune, most importantly. It's also reflection on what we are to make ethically of the discoveries of the sciences, how to take them into our lives. Reflection of this kind makes no groundbreaking discoveries. In fact, the concept of discovery in anything like the way it applies to science is for the most part alien to it. Aristotle's writings on biology are now of only historical interest, but for as long as we are educated, we'll consider, engage with, and perhaps learn from what he said about ethics, politics, and tragedy. Ditto for Socrates' affirmation that it's better to suffer evil than to do it. I could produce a very long list of artists of various kinds and philosophers for whom this is true. Thinking about them requires, of course, conscientious attention to relevant evidence of a factual kind. It requires that we think logically, patiently, careful about how we move from one thought to another. But it requires also that we develop an ear for tone, for what rings false, for what's sentimental or has yielded to pathos, and so on. The development of such a sensibility is not optional in reflection about the human condition, indeed about anything that really matters ethically. Without it, we lose our subject matter. Of fundamental importance in what I've just now been saying is that insofar, and this is a bit dense, for which I apologize, but it is important to what I have to say. Insofar as there is occasion to avoid sentimentality in factual and scientific inquiry, it's because it can cause cognitive failure of a kind that can be characterized without reference to sentimentality, or even to the fact that we're beings vulnerable to it. Being drunk or tired or having a splitting headache can be causes of that kind of cognitive failure. In the case of reflection on the human condition and on ethical matters, sentimentality is not only a cause of cognitive failure, but also a form of it, one in which feeling and thought, style and content can't be separate. The same is true of being tone deaf or vulnerable to pathos. When these terms function as forms rather than only as causes of cognitive failure, they mark out a distinctive realm, which I've called the realm of meaning, because we appeal so often to those categories when, for example, we ask, can't you see what it means to humiliate this person as you're doing? Or when a remorseful person might say that only now does she understand the full meaning of what she's done. Being a cognitive realm, the realm of meaning has a conception distinctive to it of what it is to try to see things as they are, rather than as they appear from many bad perspectives. A distinctive conception of what, in this realm, it is for things to be as they are. Well, earlier I said that the requirement to make human beings of ourselves has no end. It's not one that some of us could fulfill more quickly than others because we're smarter or in other ways better at it. Then I was making a point about human beings as individuals. The same is true, I believe, of human beings in various forms of collectivities. The humanity we affirm when we speak of the common humanity of all the peoples of the earth is not fixed, is not a discovery upon which ideally we could settle, upon which reflection by the peoples of the earth could converge on the ethical significance of what it is that we have in common. When he reviewed my book, A Common Humanity, Thinking About Love and Truth and Justice, Greg Denning, an Australian historian, wrote, "For Gaita, humanity is not a noun, it's a verb." One of my daughters has said flatly, "No, it's not." But anyway, taking my cue from him, I'd say that our sense of our common humanity will be forever verbing, so to speak, forever being made, but necessarily with no end, no completion. And this is a point of considerable political importance. I'll discuss it first in connection with national politics and turn later to international politics. I'm not sure, but I suspect that the hope, or sometimes the injunction, that we should see all the peoples of the earth as sharing a common humanity is in part a response by the Western intelligentsia to the racism shown to indigenous peoples of the lands that were colonised, to people of colour, as we now say. There's a danger of imposing on such peoples a conception of what their humanity most truly is, of what it would be, of what its fullest realisation would be. Racism is again on the rise in many parts of the world, and so is dehumanisation, in some cases demonisation of our enemies. They came together in attitudes to ISIS, and in some parts of the world have spread to Muslims and some immigrants, as effortlessly as water flowing downwards in a channel. For many of my generation, this is a particular cause of grief, perhaps the expression of our privileged naivety. Never in human history, perhaps, has there been a generation as fortunate as mine. I was born in 1946, with such hope, but perhaps hope shallowly rooted. Nonetheless, despite its many ambiguities, sometimes its hypocrisy and foolishness, the Western intelligentsia's discovery of a moral and spiritual depth in practices and beliefs that had previously seemed only to express the superstitions of scientifically backward savages, that's one of the admirable achievements of the latter half of the 20th century. But as I've suggested, that discovery was not for the most part based on showing the empirical beliefs expressed in racist stereotypes were false. It was the discovery that the culture of Indigenous peoples possessed, as the great Australian anthropologist W.H. Stanner put it, I quote, "all the beauty of song, mime, dance and art of which human beings are capable," end of quote. It amounted to a new capacity to see in black cultures an ever-deepening responsiveness to the defining facts of the human condition, and therefore to see them as cultures from which we could learn what it can be to lead a good life and what's worth devoting one's energies to. It's uncontroversial that Australian Aboriginal peoples think differently about what it means to be human than do non-Aboriginal Australians. The difference can be described most generally as lying in their attitude to the natural world and to their place in it. And that's vague, of course, but it's enough to sustain the point that the difference has inevitably shown itself politically in, for example, disputes and court rulings about land and title, and in the many, sometimes angry arguments about what would count truly as reconciliation as opposed to merely symbolic gestures towards it. Understanding by the non-Indigenous peoples of Australia of the wrongs committed against the Indigenous peoples depends on a critical ethical understanding of what they suffered. Understanding of that can never be too distant from inwardness with the stories and other forms of art that express that suffering. If that's so, then it's obvious that for the most part, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples of Australia do not have a fully shared understanding of that suffering, and therefore of how it should inform the ethical characterisation of the crimes against them. ethical characterization that make those crimes what they are. Given their ethically different conception of what it is to be human, how, for example, should the Aboriginal peoples understand the idea of a crime against humanity, if the concept of humanity plays any serious role in the ethical understanding of such a crime? The development of such understanding, one that is truly shared, that truly represents an understanding common to the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal members of Australia, would be unnerving, radical in the sense of going to the roots, and would almost certainly be novel to the classical traditions of Western political thought. The first step towards it would be to acknowledge that because the Aboriginal peoples were conquered by force to which they've never consented, in treaties, for example, they are effectively under occupation, not as that is defined in international law, but morally nonetheless. If you think that's an exaggeration, a step too far, then listen to Pat Dodson, an Aboriginal elder. I take it for granted that quite a lot of this, if not all of it, applies to the Indigenous peoples of the US. This is a quote from Pat Dodson. While the 1788 invasion was unjust, the real injustice was the denial by Governor Phillip and subsequent governments of our right to participate equally in the future of a land we had managed successfully for millenniums. Instead, the land was stolen, not shared. Our political sovereignty was replaced by virulent forms of serfdom. Our spiritual beliefs denied and ridiculed. Our system of education undermined. We were no longer able to inculcate our young with the complex knowledge that's acquired from intimate engagement with the land and its waterways. The introduction of superior weapons, alien diseases, a policy of racism and enforced biogenetic practices created dispossession, a cycle of slavery, and attempted destruction of our society. The 1997 report, Bringing Them Home, highlighted the infringement of the UN definition of genocide and called for a national apology and compensation of those Aborigines who had suffered under laws that destroyed Indigenous societies and sanctioned biogenetic modification of the Aboriginal peoples. End of quote. Well, Aboriginal peoples have no power in Australia of the kind that could force anything on the non-Indigenous peoples. No power to enforce them to negotiate a treaty, for example. That's very humiliating for them, but it's a fact. And it's a fact that whatever further justice they are given will be a function of the openness of non-Aboriginal Australians to seeing that justice must be done. And most importantly, to the point I'm making, seeing what that comes to, if it's true, to the history of the dispossession of the Aboriginal peoples of their lands. For that to happen, non-Aboriginal peoples must come to see what is at issue from the perspective of Aboriginal peoples. And that requires more than we usually mean by empathy, because it depends on acquiring new concepts or modifying old ones. And those concepts will determine the character and content of empathy. They will not be the products of empathy. The nature of compassion and empathy is always a function of the concepts under which we respond to other people's suffering or see the world as they do. Victims of injustice often suffer physical and psychological trauma, but they also suffer the injustice of its infliction, which is often an irreducible focus of their torment and of their need for the justice done to them to be acknowledged in the spirit in which the psychological and physical damage is ameliorated. Apology, forgiveness, atonement, punishment, these are appropriate responses, conceptually appropriate responses to that resentment and torment. And compassion and empathy must be informed by that understanding of what it is to commit and to suffer injustice. When people's souls have been lacerated by the wrongs done to them individually or collectively, openness to their voices requires humbled attention. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber said the basic difference between monologue and fully valid conversation is, quote, the otherness, or more concretely, the moment of surprise. His point was not merely that we must be open to hearing surprising things. We must be open to being surprised at the many ways we may justly and humanly relate to one another in a spirit of truthful dialogue. It's in conversation, rather than in advance of it, that we discover, never alone but always together, what it means really to listen and what tone may properly be taken. Only in conversation can we discover the many things conversation can be. Well, nobody can say what would happen if, through such conversations, non-Indigenous Australians understood better how Aboriginal peoples experience the crimes committed against them, and therefore how that understanding should inform the ways that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples will be able to say we, truthfully and justly, in political fellowship. It might not be we Australians. We might have to change the name of the country. Maybe not, but I can't see how one can respond with humility to Dodson's words and at the same time rule that out. I turn now to international politics, or more precisely, to the place that the idea of a common humanity should have in international law and the importance of such law to the ideal that the peoples of the earth might form what could honestly be called a community of nations. Anyone who's taken an interest in the discussion that international law is not only Eurocentric in its applications, which of course it is, but also in the concepts, or some of its fundamental concepts, will be sympathetic to my claim that what I said about the understanding of the wrongs suffered by the Aboriginal peoples applies for the most part to international law. There too, ethically inflected concepts of humanity are not fixed. There too, there's much to be learned about how different communities understand what it means to do and suffer the wrongs that are prescribed in important instruments of international law. Responding in 1948 to the evil of the Holocaust, the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights spoke of the contempt for human rights that have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. 2 years earlier, the United Nations General Assembly resolution on genocide declared genocide to be, quote, a shock to the conscience of mankind, contrary to moral law and to the spirit and aims of the United Nations, and a crime which, quote, the civilized world condemns. Yet at the same time as those words were written, the peoples of the European nations who drafted them and created international law looked upon most of the peoples of the earth as primitive savages, who of their very nature were incapable of the kind of understanding presupposed in what is meant by speaking of genocide as, quote, a shock to the conscience of mankind, even though some of those peoples had been the victims of colonial genocides. It's a small thing perhaps, but revealing nonetheless, that like millions of other children when I was a boy, I listened to Tarzan on the radio, read Tarzan comics and watched Tarzan films. When I recall that, I'm astonished by the complacent racism that showed itself in the fact that I and others found nothing objectionable to the contempt for black Africans they often expressed. Black Africans and most people of colour were invisible to our moral faculties. More deeply, they were invisible to what it is that enables us to take for granted that other human beings have inner lives that can be deep or shallow, and if they're shallow, that they could be called upon to rise to something better. We didn't think that black Africans or people of colour were shallow. We thought they didn't even exist in a conceptual space in which attributions of depth and shallowness have point or sense. It's of course natural, and I think it's right to say that we did not see black Africans as fully human. But the moral of my discussion of the relations between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians is that when we acknowledge that racism against them is a denial of their full humanity, we should not think that implies that we now fully acknowledge their humanity, that we now know what the ethically inflected sense of humanity should come to in our relations with them. Rather, we must together, rather than unilaterally, see what we can make of differing conceptions of it. We can't assume that in the end, if only we are patient, sensitive, generous, and attentive enough, we'll agree. We might not. and we'll then have to see what we make politically of that fact, and ditto for international policies. Token acknowledgement by the nations of the earth as they are represented in the UN of the prescriptions of international law and the opportunistic use of them has disguised how little real agreement there is about the ethical content of what it means to commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide. It's covered the many gaps in anything that might truthfully be called a shared understanding of this. Nonetheless, though some dictatorially criminal governments have shamelessly responded to criticism of their conduct as Western impertinence, the protestation that talk of human rights is a Western imposition on the ethical traditions of other cultures sometimes has point. Indeed, one could say that the way we now speak of human rights has paradoxically made it difficult to identify the deepest of our ethical reasons for inventing the idea in the first place, and that indeed, rather than supporting the idea of a common humanity, it undermines the prospect of it. I suspect that many of you will find that too paradoxical even to be intelligible, so I'll try to explain why I say it, seeking help from Simone Weil, a French philosopher who died in 1944 at the age of 33. In a slightly unfair polemic against the moral importance we accord to human rights, she says, and I quote, "If someone tries to browbeat a farmer to sell his eggs at a moderate price, the farmer can say, 'I have the right to keep my eggs if I don't get a good enough price.' But if a young girl's being forced into a brothel, she'll not talk about her rights. In such a situation, the word would sound ludicrously inadequate." End of quote. The reason Weil says it would be ludicrously inadequate for the girl to protest that her rights have been violated is not because it would be pointless to do so, although of course it would. It's because she believes that the concept of rights is of itself, or by itself, radically incapable of taking us to understanding of the moral terribleness of what the girl suffers. Imagine someone who said, "My God, look at what that brute did to her. He violated her human rights." That would seem like a parody. What's terrible is not that he violated her rights, it's that he violated her. I hope I'll not be misunderstood about this. I'm not suggesting that we try to banish talk of human rights, although Simone Weil came close to it. The battles for what we call human rights and for the acceptance that all the peoples of the earth share an inalienable dignity that defines their common humanity have been amongst the noblest in Western history. God only knows where we would have been had we not fought and won so many of those battles. But I'd make, however, 2 points. The first would have been elaborated as the substance of my lecture had I followed my original plan. I would have developed the deep reservations I have about the way we speak about human rights and human dignity when it carries a capital D to distinguish it from dignity of the ordinary kind that one fears to lose as a result of injury or enfeebled old age, for example. Like Simone Weil, I fear that our commitment to human rights rests on an illusion, one that's reinforced by the way we talk about dignity or the inalienable dignity, that no matter how unrelentingly savage or cruel our oppressors may be, we can retain a dignity that they cannot touch. But some people suffer affliction so terrible, either through natural causes or because of human cruelty, affliction that crushes their spirit so completely that the heroic key in which we talk about dignity and inalienable human rights just sounds like whistling in the dark. My second but related point is that talk of human rights needs to be embedded in, to draw on, to be richly mindful of, and always take us back to a richer vocabulary that reveals what it means ethically for a person's human rights to have been seriously violated. If we rely on the concepts of rights to do much of the ethical work alone, we will uproot it from its source and find ourselves ethically illiterate in the characterization of the terrible wrongs that people suffer, wrongs that, as the phrase human rights suggests, should be of concern to all human beings by virtue of the fact that they are human beings. Then talk of rights will undermine rather than support the hope that the peoples of the earth will acknowledge their common humanity and the profound ethical implications of that acknowledgement. We will undermine the prospects of the kind of conversation between the peoples of the earth that would give us reason to hope that we could become genuinely a community of nations, made such by rendering ourselves answerable to international law, at least in regard to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Well, just as racism is resurgent in many parts of the world, so are ugly forms of nationalism often together. Many people throughout the world are ashamed of this, of the cruel treatment of asylum seekers and of immigrants fleeing terrible lives, if not actually persecution, and in some countries of the treatment of their indigenous peoples. Shame is an interesting concept when applied to national politics. It's a way of acknowledging responsibility for something that one has become caught up in, even though one may not be guilty by deed or omission, though of course one may be. This kind of shame presupposes that people's identities have been formed by their attachment to, often love of, their country. They express that identity when they use we to express national fellowship, rather than merely to record the fact that they belong with others to a national group. Paul Keating, a former Prime Minister of Australia, gave a famous speech in which he expressed this powerfully. I quote, "We brought the diseases and the alcohol. We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers. We practiced discrimination and exclusion," end of quote. Many people were moved to acknowledge the ethical significance of what he said, of the kind of responsibility to which he appealed in that use of we. That sense of fellowship goes deeper than pride of shame or shame that people can feel collectively considered only as citizens, in part because it's historically deeper than citizenship sometimes is, and because it involves attachment to, sometimes love of, aspects of a country in which even the most dutiful citizen need have no interest whatsoever. The countryside, the light, the literature, the song, for example. Such people for whom shame is a painful form of love for, rather than a reason to reject their country, try to awaken in their fellow citizens an acknowledgement that they share a common humanity with asylum seekers and their families, and to make such an acknowledgement inseparable from the we of national fellowship, hoping that most of their fellow nationals will embrace rather than resist the fact that their nation belongs to a community of nations, constituted as such by international law. Conservative politicians speak more often of love of country, of pride in what the national nation has achieved, and what soldiers have done to protect the national interests, than politicians of the left. Talk of national shame, however, and worse, the suggestion that our soldiers, like the soldiers of all nations, should be answerable to international criminal courts, is anathema, mostly to conservative politicians. But by the same token, the refusal by many on the left to take seriously the need most human beings have for roots, realised in national forms, has, I believe, been one of the reasons for Brexit and of Donald Trump's election, and the development of right-wing national paranoia more generally. Because the left generally has not been prepared to take seriously talk of love of country, fearing that it will always decline into ugly, often murderous forms, it has not taken seriously the question, how can we prevent attachment to country from degenerating into jingoism? And what kind of road can we build on which jingoism might find its way to love? The obligation to think hard about this is fundamental, I believe, and urgent, because the need people have for roots will not go away anytime soon. The reasons go deep. Here's Simone Weil again, I quote her. We owe a cornfield respect, not because of itself, but because it's food for human beings. In the same way, we owe respect to a collectivity, a country, a family, or any other, not for itself, but because it's food for the certain number of human souls. One sack of corn can always be substituted by another sack. The food that a collectivity supplies for the souls of those who form part of it has no equivalent in the entire universe. End of quote. Real love of country can be identified by at least two markers. by the desire to love truthfully and by the desire to love without shame that would be the only truthful response to the wrongs done on behalf of the nation by its leaders or in time of war by its soldiers. Because it fastens onto something that is inevitably a mixture of good and evil, love of country is always a mixture of gratitude, pain, joy, sorrow, pride, shame, and sometimes guilt. In the circumstances that make them appropriate, each of these can be a form of love of country, just as severe criticism of one's country can be a form of loyalty to it, and the desire to love without shame and without lies a form of concern for its welfare. This indicates that we should not conceive of the ethical imperatives intrinsic to love of country and that distinguish it from aggressive nationalism as ethical constraints that are external to the concept of the national interest. Instead, we should think of it as intrinsic to an enriched conception of the national interest and a hard-headed, practically minded insistence that one desires to love without shame. Jingoism is related to love of country as counterfeit coin is to real money. Nobody wants counterfeit money or counterfeit anything else. For Jingoists to see themselves as I believe they are requires a radical change, not incremental steps towards a different perspective, certainly not incremental steps in argument, but a gestalt switch. Pride rather than love is their defining attitude towards country. Pride, but never shame. In part, as I suggested earlier, the cultural condescension of an intelligentsia that disdained all talk of love of country made it very difficult for them to make that switch. Love of country that's lucid acknowledges that other peoples love their countries and that the food for their souls that the real love of country can provide for other peoples also has, quote, no equivalent in the entire universe. And for that reason, there is no reason to wish to become citizens of the world, ruled by a world government in order to resist the terrible consequences of aggressive nationalism. It's best that we remain citizens of particular nations that are part of a community of nations and who find in that community the political realization that all the peoples of the earth share a common humanity. Just as a sense of fellow national feeling would be sentimental unless supported by the institutions of justice that show that it matters to us that our fellow citizens are wronged and that wrongdoers remain our fellow citizens, justly held to account but never banished. So the idea of a common humanity will be empty, as will the ideal of a community of nations, unless nations show a concern for the grievous wrong done to peoples of other nations. Admittedly, the sense in which such a community exists is still rather thin, and so therefore is the sense in which derogation of some international obligations as defined in international law is an offence against humankind. But it's not meaningless. The ethical core of the concept of a crime against humanity, I suggest, is that it's a crime against the constituency of humankind, crimes that must be a concern of all human beings in their capacity as political beings. And that, as I said earlier, is a precondition for the existence of a community of nations answerable to international law. They are crimes of concern to all human beings for whom it matters that their political identity is partly formed by the fact that they belong to such a community of nations. Well, if I'm right that the need to love one's country without shame should be intrinsic to an enriched conception of the national interest, and if the desire for a truthful love of country is partly but essentially what distinguishes genuine love of country from jingoism, then the need for truth and the need for trust when truth is justifiably withheld is fundamental to an ethically enriched conception of the national interest. Whatever one thinks of Julian Assange and or Edward Snowden, it is, I think, uncontroversial that they have shown that most governments have betrayed that trust, insisting upon degrees of secrecy that rots democracy. In the periodic table, Primo Levi spoke of his disgust and his despair at the degree to which the fascists had polluted the political life of Italy with their lies during World War II. Polluted is his word. We speak naturally of the way that lies may pollute, poison, defile, or degrade things that are precious to us, relationships, institutions such as universities or the press, and sometimes the entire political life of a nation. In such ways of speaking, we show something about the way truth may matter to us. You can describe something as polluted or defiled only if you think of it as precious. The need for truth amongst people for whom truthfulness is fundamental to their conception of political dignity can be precious. But it can be precious to them too as individual human beings. In times of conflict, when citizens are killed in battle or by terrorists, we grieve as citizens, and some of us just as human beings who love them. Nobody wants to grieve in cloud cuckoo land, just as nobody wants their pride or their love to be based on lies. That is why truth is both a need of the political realm, of lucid patriotism, and of the soul. Earlier, when I spoke of what would count as real conversation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, I said that only in such conversation would they discover what it means for them to speak truthfully of a common humanity. I emphasise that the meaning of humanity in the phrase a common humanity is not fixed. The ethically necessary aspiration by the non-Indigenous population to realise in political form a sense of common humanity with the Indigenous population could not, if it were truly just, presuppose a fixed understanding of what it is to be human and of how a sense of common humanity might be realised between them. Nor can it fully presuppose the kind of sensibility necessary for such conversation, but it will fail unless it's a sensibility shaped by categories responsive to art, and will also fail if the development of such a sensibility is seen as merely the occasion for being able, competently, to abstract from art, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, a cognitive content that bypasses the categories that define the realm of meaning, as I described it earlier, an ear for tone, the need to avoid sentimentality, pathos, and so on. And this is a failing to which the intelligentsia, educated in the dominant parts of the Western tradition, are particularly vulnerable, because they tend to think of the need to avoid such failings as the need to avoid causes of cognitive failure rather than forms of it. They believe that ideally genuinely cognitive content can always be abstracted from the style in which it's expressed and assessed in a tone-free, style-free zone, to which the objection that what someone said betrayed sentimentality or pathos is as irrelevant as lodging such an objection to a proposition in physics or mathematics. Earlier I mentioned Stanner, who discovered in Aboriginal people's art all the beauty of song, mime and dance of which human beings are capable. But that's a judgment we trust only if we think it wasn't the expression of sentimentality or some similar failing of a kind I said earlier defined the realm of meaning. We wouldn't trust Stanner's judgment if we thought it to be the expression of Western romanticism about, quote, primitive cultures. It's hard to see how one could find beauty in another culture or depth unless one took the beauty or depth to be a lucid achievement. And that means that the beauty he saw was achieved against temptations intrinsic to all cultural achievement, to forms of inauthenticity, second-hand opinion, cliché, sentimentality, and so on. And I believe the same must be true of the conversation between the peoples of the earth that would be about the ethical content of the principles of international law, as that content would be expressed in the preambles to those instruments. It's a truism that international law that constitutes the nations of the earth as a community of nations expresses values that are in some sense universal. But what kind of universality is presupposed? It's natural and common to think that the universal values expressed in those laws are principles that can be abstracted from the cultures of the nations that are answerable to those principles. Those values, this thought continues, could be, and ideally should be, expressed in a language that consciously prescinds from the local, historically conditioned associations and resonances of natural languages. But there's another way of thinking about universality. It's suggested by the idea that great literature potentially speaks to all the peoples of the earth, but only is translated from one natural language to another. That's not because we've been unable to develop a single universal language, as some hope to do with Esperanto. It's because that is the kind of universality that is appropriate to the content of literature, content which often can't be separated from its form, and whose form can't be separated from the contingencies that have nourished particular cultures, particular forms of living, and particular natural languages. Our understanding of what it means to commit and to suffer the crimes prohibited by international law, what it means, for example, to commit or be a victim of genocide, is often deepened by art. When a film, a painting, a play, a novel, or a poem moves us, for example. And art provides, as I've just said, a different model for universality than does science, or of a political or moral philosophy that seeks to abstract universal principles from the concrete circumstances of people's lives. Every writer needs an address, said Isaac Bashevis Singer. Well, that's a fine way of putting the point I've been making, but it doesn't apply only to writers. It's true of anyone who seeks lucidity in the realm of meaning, which, if I'm right, is the only place where one can seek understanding of the human condition. Our understanding of what it is for something to be offered as a reason in much of what we say about ethical, religious, and political matters is conditioned by the concepts that define the realm of meaning, which means that we should acknowledge the public reason is inescapably in medias res, in the midst of things. It's in the realm of meaning that we argue about what counts as love, including love of one's neighbour or love of God. It's there that we argue about what it means to wrong someone and what kind of compassion might be shown to the afflicted. It's there that we argue about how we should respond morally and legally to people who have done the most terrible things and who are totally lacking in remorse. It's there that we discuss what it means for someone to be tortured, or what it is that's so terrible about genocide, what it means for a woman to be raped in war, so that we should call that rape a crime against humanity. It's there that we discuss what it means morally for something to be a crime against humanity, and indeed what it is for something to be a crime. It's there that we discuss what it is for something to count genuinely as love of country rather than jingoism, of what it means morally to be ashamed of the deeds of the country one loves, and so on. In many ways, our discussion of these matters are attuned, sometimes well, sometimes badly, to the tones, resonances, and allusions of the natural languages in which we conduct those conversations. And just as every writer needs an address, though of course it might be more than one, so in the realm of meaning, language must often be spoken and heard at full stretch, as Cora Diamond put it, if we are to see things as they are, or if we are even able to make ourselves worthy of trying to see things as they are. Sorry, that was so bad.
Thank you so much.
Shall I vacate the stage?
No, that was perfect. We have a few minutes for questions and answers. We'll be able to answer further questions and discuss these very complex matters. Any questions from the audience? Yes. Could you wait for the microphone? We want everyone to hear the question. I think you pushed the bottom. No?
The universal of different sorts, inability to operate audiovisual equipment.
Yeah, this one works.
Hello?
Try this one.
Or this one?
It's not that great a question. The build-up is going to be difficult to sustain here. Anyway, Rob Winthrop, Department of Anthropology here at the university. Thank you very much for an interesting talk. Since much of your references concretely referred to Aboriginal and other indigenous peoples, let me just pose a broad question and be interested in your answer. I tend to think of the framework of human rights as it evolves from the Enlightenment as focused fundamentally on the right of the individual, the inherent dignity of the individual. And in some sense, I don't think there are any people in the world or any peoples in the world who would disagree with that as, in some sense, as a proposition. But at the same time, my own work, which has been mainly with American Indian tribes and their rights and its conflicts over resource development and so on, have underlined, and it's been made by points been made by many others, of the collective character, that is the social and cultural character of who you are. If you want to speak of everybody has an address or needs to have an address, for most peoples of the world, that address is also something that is shared and is collective, and there is inevitably some conflict at times between rights framed as an individual characteristic and the rights and interests of groups. So I just wonder if you can comment on how that might be dealt with.
Yeah, I think I think, as you say, it's relatively uncontroversial that rights, as they've historically been framed, have been rights of individuals. Indeed, there's a very interesting book that came out recently. There's a bestseller called East-West Street. I don't know if you've seen it. The Origins of Crimes Against Humanity and Genocide, where the point is made very strongly that crimes against humanity should be regarded as crimes against individual rights, and genocide as crimes against groups or collectivities. I think the wrongs done to peoples fall under many descriptions, right? So, or many characterizations. So it seems to me that the wrongs suffered by indigenous peoples are wrongs suffered by those individuals, and one can characterize those as the violation of their rights when it's appropriate. I should say straight up front, I'm not sure that we would have lost anything conceptually if we had never introduced the concept of rights. What matters to me is that the ethical importance it has is because it identifies a particular kind of wrong, and often one which only an individual can suffer under a relevant moral description. But often that same individual will suffer a wrong under a description that relates to that person's, let's say, ethnic identity. So to give an example, if you go to the Holocaust Museum in Prague, there'll be names of all the individuals who in Prague were were murdered. But underneath it says these were the victims of genocide. And there's no tension here between the identification of them as individuals whose rights were obviously violated according to so many different, in so many different ways, but who also suffered a distinctive crime of being treated as vermin, unfit to inhabit the earth as Jews. And this comes out very obviously in survivors, where they may have been tortured, they may have all sorts of, their rights may have been violated in all sorts of ways in their camp, and they suffer a sense of that wrong. Although again, I would say, considered as rights violated, you don't get very far in describing it merely as that. To reveal the moral terribleness of it, you have to embed it in a richer language. But they also, and this is a sort of inseparable from the trauma they suffer, as survivors think of themselves as having, as an attempt, there was an attempt to liquidate them as unfit to. And what pains them most is that their children and their relatives were murdered in that spirit. So it seems to me that there need be no clash here. That in at least from the point of what I'm interested in conveying here is that what in the end we're politically concerned with is the ethical characterizations of what it is that makes us protest. Sometimes we make that protest very specifically in terms of individual rights being violated, sometimes in a language which is more reminiscent of ethnic identity or so on. But I don't think that they conflict. And I think that little thing in the Prague Museum is a really, really good example.
Over here.
Yeah, I would just like to, this isn't a question, it's rather part of a response, because I myself have done some work on indigenous peoples' rights and have spent time in Latin America and worked with Latin American indigenous rights movements, and I've also been a part of the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Peoples. It's now a permanent forum. It was a working group when I participated. So what I simply want to add to this conversation is that, in fact, there is a very active international socio-legal, political, leaving aside the ethical, moral realm, conversation on collective rights. And the Universal Declaration of Indigenous Rights, which was declared about 8 years ago, contains some conceptually path-breaking collective rights frameworks. And in fact, one of the terms I was going to ask about this, but I'll simply put this out as part of a response, is that they identify a new international crime of ethnocide, which is distinct from genocide and has precisely the character of an attempt to eradicate collective identity, regardless of the nature of the physical destruction or physical violation of individual life, liberty, and physical integrity. So I think it's very important that we keep track of that, because it is precisely something that can bridge between some of this historically lagging, I would say not that it's missing, but that it's lagging, the concept of collective rights. And there are places it's taking place, and it's politically powerful, which is what I'll be talking about this afternoon.
But I suppose I should point out, actually, that because I gave a different paper, the focus really wasn't what I read so much on human rights as the idea of what talk of a common humanity might come to. But these are obviously not unrelated topics. But in response to what I was saying, if we want to invent the name of a new crime, ethnocide or politicide, there are all sorts of sides that are now being canvassed because of the debates around genocide, or what counts as genocide and what so on. What we have to give an account of why ethically these things matter to us. And these categories by themselves don't convey it. And my lament, in a way, has been that there's become a kind of disengagement for a number of complex reasons. One has to do with the idea that in the end, if we're to achieve, well, there was a practical idea that in the end, if we are to achieve something, we must abstract from all these different cultures and direct principles. The other is that there's a deep belief that that's where the real cognitive content lies anyhow. That anything that it really is dependent on a rich natural language use, as I put it, at full stretch, in which form and content are inseparable. That can't be genuinely cognitive content. The cognitive content has to be abstracted from that. I think that's a mistake. And I mean, whether it's genocide or ethnocide, in the end, what one has to unpack is the ethically complex nature of all those crimes. I mean, if just take genocide as an example. Genocide is often described as the crime of crimes, or one of the very worst of the crimes against humanity. And yet, according to the Convention on Genocide, there can be genocides without a single murder in the service of a genocidal intent. So it can't be the case that it's still the crime of crimes, unless we think that the it deserves the category of the crime of crimes for reasons other than moral reasons. And I think there's a case for saying that. And I think the case for saying that was made, in fact, by Hannah Arendt in Eichmann in Jerusalem. But her idea of genocide, that it's essentially a crime against plurality, obviously isn't a moral category. It's an ethical category, but not a moral one, because if you were to say, you know what's terrible? We saw the rape, we saw the torture, we saw them being dragged off to the gas chambers, and you know what was terrible? It was a crime against human diversity. That's ridiculous. But what we have to do, it seems to me, is in all these cases, bring out in an ethically, not necessarily morally, rich language, why it is that these things are of deep concern. And we won't do that just by multiplying the number of sides, because we recognise that their distinctions need to be made.
So much for a very insightful presentation. My question is that often we see human rights is discussed in isolation with,
I'm sorry, I have to come closer because I've just got myself new hearing aids.
Oh, okay. Often we see that the issues of human rights is discussed in isolation to leadership, governance, the meanings of power and dominance and things like that. And when violation of human rights is always from a sort of corrupt or brutal leadership. So how do you explain that the leadership or the meaning of power or dominance or these things have to be also equally discussed and
Well, I think that's a complex and big area. But in the case of the Aboriginals in Australia, I did actually refer to the fact that in terms of the power, anything that looks remotely like coercive power through organisation or anything else, to change their quite wretched condition, it's just not on. And they feel this to be a deep humiliation. And they constantly speak as though they do have power. And they can make demands and so on, when they can't. And the reason they feel it humiliation is because they feel if they can't exercise power against the power that is being exercised, then they're somehow supplicants, having to beg. And indeed, one of the motives for the development of human rights in the earlier part of last century for René Cassin was when he came back from the First World War and saw with how humiliated the soldiers were by the French government. And part of the ethical idea for human rights there was, I can demand it. Right? I don't have to ask, I don't have to protect, and others can demand. But it seems to me what's really important in the characterization of those power relations is to be able to, again, ethically describe ethically in the many dimensions of the ethical, the moral, the legal and political, in a way that reveals what's really at issue. In the way it seems to me, in a way this seems to me just obvious, that you don't reveal what's at issue if you say, can't you see a basic right has been violated? That relies on something else. But its power to engage with something, its capacity to engage with something else depends on our literacy in that something else. And it's a literacy I think we're losing because it seems so often enough for us to say, can't you see a rights are being violated? And we think that's enough. And it's not. And I've been arguing, and this was an important part of my case, ethical literacy in what it means for, literacy in the ethical dimensions of rights violation depends on a sensibility. When there's a discussion, someone says, you think that only because you're sentimental, or someone says, I saw this incredible film about the way indigenous peoples were being treated in the US. And somebody says, yeah, it was powerful, but that's because the music was constantly seducing you, or you're so liable, tone deaf to pathos, something like that. Right? That happens all the time. And when we come out of something where we're inclined to say, I've learned something I didn't understand before. That we use those critical terms, implicitly or implicitly. But the interesting thing about, I'm speaking now as a philosopher, you can go to philosophy classes anywhere, I think, and you won't have these concepts discussed when people are talking about moral objectivity, or when they're talking about the legitimate and illegitimate forms of persuasion, when you're legitimately intellectually persuaded. You won't hear them discussed. And the reason is, I think, because it's assumed that they're just psychological states that muddle your thoughts in the way that being drunk muddles your thoughts, or being overheated muddles your thoughts, and so on. So that's why, if I can put it there, that's why I thought that part of my talk was important. And I'm sorry that my brain is still a little bit further away.
I'm sorry, for the sake of staying on schedule, I'm going to stop here. There's some coffee and other refreshments at the back. If you could take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and hear the next speaker. Thank you so much, Professor Gaita. Thank you.